Hi, my name's Susan O'Connor and I'm demonstrating Featherstitch for you on behalf of the Smocking Arts Guild of America. Featherstitch has a long association with smocking as it was the stitch that was used to decorate traditional smocks. It's regarded as a linear stitch and it creates a lovely, delicate, fine tracery of thread on the surface of the fabric. To work a basic feather stitch, it's helpful to work some lines onto the fabric, and you need to use something that you can remove because the stitching will not cover the lines. So something like a friction pen or an air-soluble or a water-soluble marker is excellent. To work a basic feather stitch, you need to have 4 lines on your fabric, and these are evenly spaced, although the 2 center lines can be closer to one another if you would like them to be. To work the stitch, you bring the thread up at the top of the left-hand line, pull it through, and then the needle goes back down through the fabric at the top of the 3rd line in the sequence. Pull your needle through. You then want to bring the needle to the surface again on the 2nd line, but a short space down from the top. And when you pull the needle through, that's going to create your first stitch. So just give the thread a tug until it settles firmly on the fabric but doesn't pull or distort the fabric. Now your second stitch, you're going to take the needle to the back through the fabric, level with where you brought the thread to the surface to complete the first stitch. So the needle goes down through the 4th line, and you can see it's level with that stitch there. Pull the thread through, again leaving the loop on the top of the fabric, and then bring the thread to the surface. Now when you're working this in your hand, you can actually scoop this stitch, and if you do that, you want to make sure that the angle of the needle, you can see that there, if I was scooping this stitch, my needle like that, and it's parallel to this stitch here. And that's quite important because if you make it's too angled, it means that the stitch is too long, and if it's not angled enough, it means that this stitch is too short. So you need to make sure that these stitches are parallel so that your feather stitches don't grow in size as you work down the line. The needle to the surface and pull the thread through, and that's the second stitch. To work the 3rd stitch, put the thread over to the left-hand side. Again, you're going to take the needle to the back at the same level as the thread came out to finish the last stitch. Through there, and then again you want to make this stitch and bring it up so that if it was on the surface, it would be parallel to that last stitch. So down there and then come up, and I'm coming up on the 2nd line. Over to this side, the needle goes down through the fabric, level with where the thread was coming out from the last stitch, pull through, leave a loop, bring the thread to the surface, pull through, and there's your stitch. And then once you get to the end of the line to finish it off, you go over the last loop of stitch, pull through, and that is your finished line of feather stitch. I'm working a straight line. You can work curved lines, you can work spiral, you can work all sorts of shapes depending on what you want. These are some variations of feather stitch. The first one is a single feather where you just have one arm of the stitch. The second one is the classic feather that I've just shown you how to do. The next one is what's known as a double feather stitch. And then a triple feather stitch, which creates a definite zigzag pattern along the fabric. This next one is what's known as a closed feather stitch because the stitches all interlock with one another and is a really nice line of stitching where you can then add little bits of extra stitch into the spaces that's created by the stitch. And this last one is known as a long-armed feather, where the alternating left and right arms of the stitches are kept short and they create a line down the centre of the stitch. This next group of stitches are feather stitches that have just been used in unusual ways. The first one is a leaf done in feather stitch. This is very similar to, or in fact it's exactly the same as what you will find in books known as Cretan stitch, although Cretan stitch is often more open. The next one is a whipped feather stitch, where I've just whipped the centre of the stitch to create a little bit of added interest to it. The third one, I've decorated the feather stitching with French knots. And you can see the difference that is created by putting the knots on the tips of each one of the stitches, which makes quite an open design, to putting the knots in the little bowls that are created by the stitches, which tends to close the design up. And the same thing here with the beads. I've added 3 beads at the end of each of the arms of the feather stitch there to create a really pretty little floral pattern. And then above that, the beads are nestled into the little bowls that are created by the stitches, and an extra little fly stitch has been added in a darker shade of blue. This is a spiral of feather, so you can work curved lines or you can even do outlines of all sorts of shapes. And then this last one is a braided feather stitch, where I've worked 3 lines of feather stitch. The 2 green lines are worked in one direction and the central pink line is worked in the opposite direction, and that creates a really pretty wide braided line of feather stitch. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you enjoyed it.